Hi, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes for more people to join, and then we'll be back with you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this EMIS Live event discussing the rewards and challenges in integrating ePMA and pharmacy systems. So my name is Lauren Latham and I am Head of Acute Products at EMIS. We are going to be joined by James Hodgin, who's Solutions Director at Allscripts and was heavily involved in the implementation of the interface at Royal Bolton NHS Foundation Trust. From the Trust, we're going to be joined by Max Hughes as well, who's going to give us a detailed overview of the lessons learned from a customer perspective. And Stephen McEwen, who is Product Manager for Hospital Pharmacy. He's going to give a summary of the lessons learned from a supplier perspective, as well as how these lessons learned will feed into future plans. We're going to do question and answers throughout, so please feel free to type a question into the chat window. If it's appropriate, we will answer them as we go through the session, and if not, there will be time for Q&A at the end. If we get inundated with questions, we will respond to the questions after the event if we don't get round to answering them all. So the session is going to cover an overview of an interface that we've built between our EMIS Hospital Pharmacy product and Allscripts Sunrise product. This has been a first of type interface that has joined up ePMA and hospital pharmacy systems and sends medication supply requests electronically. This is really important in reducing medication supply errors, as well as drug administration errors, and as well as obviously reducing the time spent in managing medicines. There'll be a number of other key benefits that I'm sure Max will highlight to you from a customer and NHS Trust perspective as we go throughout the session. So digital health and interoperability are notoriously challenging. NHSD and X are really focusing with the interopen community on publishing common standards to encourage suppliers to join up their clinical systems. Now, we actually developed this interface in the very early stages of those discussions and the standards being created. And this has actually helped us to get a really good understanding of some of the challenges, whether that be data challenges or operational challenges in developing this type of interface. At EMIS, we are very lucky that we have an in-house data team, and they're able to update and manage all data requirements, which helps us work in quite an agile way. A little bit about EMIS before we go into the session. So EMIS, we have products in all major healthcare sectors, and one of our core objectives is ensuring that we share our data where we can and we remain as interoperable as possible. We are proudly one of the founding members, I think, of the interopen community, and we were actually named #1 supplier for interoperability in a Class 2018 report. And one of the key things for us as a business is ensuring that we continue to join up healthcare, and interoperability is really key in doing that. We worked very closely with Royal Bolton Foundation Trust and team members there to implement this interface across the entire trust. We have over 2,300 messages received a day from Allscripts, and what I think you will see throughout this session is that Bolton and the team members at Bolton took a really pragmatic approach to some of the challenges. They were identified really early on in the project, and this helped ensure that there was a timely go live and that the go live was actually delivered on time. It also allowed for incremental improvements to be made rather than aiming for a utopia straight away. Incremental improvements have been made to ensure that the project is successful. Now, Allscripts, we worked really closely with Allscripts, and they are actually a competitor to EMIS as well as a partner. We worked really closely, and I think this demonstrates where you are competitors if you put that aside and focus on the outcomes of joining up systems and being interoperable, that you can work really well together. I think one of the key things is having a really enthusiastic pilot customer, which Bolton were absolutely that. And we'll continue to work with Allscripts really closely and continue to develop our interoperability with them, whether that be adopting further standards or moving to different ways of communicating, for example, fire. So that's my introduction over. I think, James, we're going to hand over to you for a brief introduction before we move into Max's slides.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for the invitation to Lauren and the EMIS team to join in this session, something that we Allscripts were very keen to do. So for those of you who aren't aware of Allscripts, we are one of the leading global IT companies, third largest in the world. We operate across numerous different countries and in several different continents. In the UK here, we have a client base of 17 different clients, NHS trusts that we currently work with, and that is providing a variety of solutions from our portfolio. The one in particular we're talking about here today is Sunrise, so that is our electronic patient record, and as we've made reference to, that obviously includes electronic prescribing and medicines administration. So when we got involved in this project and signed the deal with Bolton to provide Sunrise, one of the conditions of that deal was to integrate with the incumbent pharmacy system, which we were delighted to do and take part in. My own experience is very much in pharmacy, that's my background, and so I was acutely aware of some of the challenges that existed there, not least from a technological and operational and really just a workflow constraints that apply. So when we entered into the project, we very quickly built a relationship with EMIS. Our technical teams were collaborating right from the outset on this, and we looked to address as many of those issues as we could moving forward. Of course, one of the primary things we had to do was all agree on standards that we were going to use. So in this instance, HL7 was a natural choice due to it's something that we use in other international fields, and obviously EMIS had that capability already as well. So there was a lot of collaboration there, and as we've directed to before, Max is going to go into a lot of the detail around that and give you the details of that journey. Just to echo as well Lauren's comments that this was very much a partnership. You know, it's not something that one group can achieve on their own. There was 3 groups in this, but I think there was probably you know, broader engagement from the wider business and from the wider environment around Bolton as well. And we delivered a first of type solution very much on time, on spec, and it's been a success, albeit we're going to hear about some of the challenges, and that's what we want to do. We want to learn the lessons collectively and ensure that, you know, each time we do this, it gets better, it gets smoother. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Max, who's going to walk you through his presentation this afternoon.
Hi everyone. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks James, thanks Lauren. So I'm just going to walk us through our experience of implementing the ePMA pharmacy interface here at Bolton. Firstly, just to introduce myself a little bit more, I'm one of the senior clinical pharmacists here at Bolton, and I specialise in our electronic prescribing systems. I led on the deployment of our ePMA system on the trust side, which, as we've already said, was Sunrise from Allscripts, and we went live in October last year. I also helped lead on the simultaneous deployment of the pharmacy interface, where we wanted to integrate with EMIS Subscribe. So I'm interested in all areas of digitisation, but particularly anywhere where we can increase the safety and efficiency of our processes. And I wanted to increase our interoperability so we could try and reduce duplication of workloads and reduce any transcription errors that occur as a result of needing to do that. It's important to point out as well that this was a team effort, so a lot of work went into it, both from Allscripts, from EMIS and from the team here at Bolton. With a special thank you going out to actually one of our ePMA pharmacy technicians, Chris Lindley, who had a huge amount of hands-on support for the interface work. So a big thanks to everyone involved. So really, some of the contents I'm going to cover are going to have a quick look at where we started before the deployment, just so everyone understands what our starting point was, and the reasons why we needed to do this, what the process practically involved, along with some of the challenges we faced and how we managed these as we went along, a bit about some of the outstanding issues that we've still got, our key lessons learned, and some of the plans for the future. So where we were starting from, quick overview is that before we embarked on the project, we already used EMIS as our pharmacy dispensary system. We also used the electronic medicines management portions of EMIS to give us a paper-like dispensary. So we didn't have an ePMA system in the trust already. We mostly worked off paper prescription charts. So the process for medicines management involved when a patient came in, a drug history would be done, it would be copied onto the back of the prescription chart, but then also transcribed into EMIS, so we had a copy held electronically. Pharmacists would check the inpatient prescription chart, and any changes to medication that were made during the patient's stay would then be transcribed into EMIS, so that we had an up-to-date record in both systems. Quite a lot of duplication going on there, and it required continuous management during the patient's stay. However, the benefits of doing it were that supply requests could be done electronically. EMIS, we could make our supply requests, it would appear in the pharmacy work list for dispensing, access checking, all without any additional paper being needed. It also meant that work came down to pharmacists steadily over the day and not in batches as work was brought down, which is what commonly happens with some of the paper systems. Nursing staff on the wards, they would request medication in a paper diary on the ward, which was then just periodically reviewed by pharmacy, and then we would do the supply request in EMIS ourselves if it was needed. And one of the biggest benefits that we had really from using a scribe at the time was that our discharge prescriptions were completely done on EMIS. So doctors would review the list of medication that we'd pre-populated in EMIS, cross-reference it with the drug chart to make sure it was up to date, and then generate the list of discharge medications. So for discharges, at least, the whole process was electronic from prescription, clinical check, dispensing and access checking. So why did we need the interface then? So as we were going to be deploying our full EPR, we needed to review everything. So we wanted to remove the existing duplication of work that we had. So we wanted to get rid of some of this dual data entry that we had, where we had to transcribe from drug charts. We wanted to reduce the risk of transcription errors, because every time something was transcribed, there's a risk of an error coming in there. We wanted to reduce the use of paper in general. So there was a small number of wards that were still using paper discharge prescriptions, such as our maternity area. So once we moved on to our full new EPR system, they would move on to the new electronic discharges. So we wanted to make sure that they didn't continue to use any paper there. We just wanted to try and reduce it down as much as possible. We did use paper supply requests for when there was no pharmacy team on the ward, so particularly things at weekends. If supply was needed, nurses would fill out a slip of paper to request a supply, and we wanted to get rid of those as well. The biggest reason, though, was really that as our discharges would be moving from EMIS into the new EPR, what was currently working fairly well was absolutely necessary to have an interface. Otherwise, all the discharge prescriptions would need to be transcribed into EMIS, and it would be a whole new set of transcriptions that would be needed, which obviously has all the errors we mentioned above. So we were aware this was going to be a first of type interface. We appreciated that we weren't going to get a perfect solution at first, but we wanted to manage the problems in a pragmatic way and just sort of see if we could get a solution that would work for us. So on to the actual process now then. So the first thing I really want to talk about is our actual formulary in the ePMA system. So like many secondary care facilities, we work on the principle of dose-based prescribing rather than product-based prescribing, which is more commonly used in primary care. So in general, our drugs have the layout of a drug moiety, a brand if it's applicable, plus a formulation. So it gives examples such as levothyroxine tablets, metformin modified release tablets, or tacrolimus Prograf capsules. The benefits of doing this is that it reduces the amount of work needed by prescribers. So they wouldn't need to prescribe for a levothyroxine dose of 75 micrograms. You don't need to prescribe 25 tablets and 50 tablets or specify 3 tablets of 25. It's just much simpler workflow for them, and it's what we've always been used to in a hospital setting. It also gives them more flexibility for nursing and pharmacy staff around what is to be supplied and administered based on what stock we actually have as readily available. We do have some products in our system that are built as virtual products or actual products, so either VMPs or AMPs, but I'll go on to those a little bit more later, so for certain situations. So now we've got the background of the formulary in the system, we can move on to the actual practical part of configuring it. So the first part we actually have to do is we had to undertake an exercise of mapping. So we reviewed the units of measure, routes of administration and frequencies that we had in both systems. And then we mapped those to any coded items that were in the EMIS interface specification. All the mappings were then placed into an interface translation table where they could be used for the purposes of the interface messages for the HL7 messages. So if we have a quick look at frequencies first, the first issue that we really came across was a lack of one-to-one mapping. So for example, twice a day is a frequency. In our ePMA system, we actually have multiple twice a day frequencies. So we'd have twice a day at 9 AM and 2 PM that we might use for diuretics, twice a day at 9 and 5 for nitrates, so you get your nitrate-free period overnight, and then just at 9 and 9 for general medication, so it's evenly spaced. As far as the EMIS specification was concerned, the best match we could really get for that was the BID code, which simply shows as twice a day in the EMIS product line. Our view on this was that this would be acceptable really, because we wouldn't necessarily routinely put all that detail on a dispensing label anyway, and patients are accustomed to probably having labels a bit more vague like that from a community setting anyway. Our pharmacy staff are quite appropriately trained, so anything that needs to be on the label above what was automatically pushed across there, we could manually add on ourselves. So for all prescriptions, the full detail of the original prescription is visible in what we call the yellow box, and that holds a full text output, non-coded, non-translated, just the original prescription as it was stated in free text in Allscripts. So that's there as a reference. So if you do need that a bit of additional information which couldn't be translated, it's there for adding on manually. Complex frequencies were not supported, and by this I mean orders that were created with the user scheduling option in Allscripts. So this is a tool which allows a prescriber to select any combination of times and days for administration. So for example, if you wanted to do folic acid tablets on a Monday and a Friday at 8 AM, you can create that schedule using this tool, but that isn't then a defined frequency that could then be appropriately mapped over the interface. So messages using that tool would just fail over the interface for anything that was more complex than a single day order. So if you want to do cholecalciferol once a day on a Monday, that's not a problem at all. But anything that gets a bit more complex, it does cause it to fail. As a workaround, we are working with EMIS to create a custom frequency along the lines of other C yellow box, with the intention that we might be able to map any of these user scheduled frequencies to that instead. That would allow us to have the items still transmit over the interface and appear, but the frequency would just state other C yellow box, and then we could manually input the exact frequency that was needed for the label. Obviously, it's not ideal, but it's an improvement over our current situation where we just get some message failures and have to manually enter them from scratch. Routes of administration. We took the opportunity while we're reviewing these to rationalise some of the information that was already in there. So there were a couple of items that couldn't be mapped, for example, an intrapericardial injection, but we decided that that wasn't actually a route that was going to be needed at the trust because we don't do any sort of procedures where that would be required, so that was just removed from the catalogue entirely. There was a couple that were a bit more tricky, so buccal wasn't a route that was available, but we found an equivalent which would just be oromucosal, which essentially was synonymous, so we were happy to use that. So there's a couple you come across, but in general it was fine. Big point to note is that multi-route prescribing is not an option. So at Bolton, it wasn't really a major issue for us because our medicines policy already stated that medicine shouldn't be prescribed via multiple routes. However, in practice, we do realise that it does have advantages to being able to do multi-route prescribing, and it is appropriate in some cases. And I know it is done at many other trusts. So if you wanted to do mifepristol tablets and you wanted them to be oral / rectally / vaginally, that's not something you could do as a multi-route prescription in the system if you want it to be able to go over the interface. So it's something for sites to consider when they're looking at doing the same. For units of measure, we didn't particularly have any problems with units of measure. After we went live, we did come across a couple of glitches. An interesting one was that nicotine inhalation cartridges were prescribed as one cartridge inhaled PRN, And then on the label, this suddenly popped up as insert 0.66 suppositories into the rectum when required. It was a really interesting error. It was related to sort of original pack dispensing, we think, but as soon as we found it, we logged it with EMIS. They worked hard and they got it fixed quite quickly. So that's the thing about working in a good partnership. We'll be able to keep on top of things like that. Inhalers, it was worth noting that there was a bit of a mixture of puffs and doses being used as a unit of measure, which was fine. It's just that they didn't necessarily correspond to the ones held in the DSS updates that are sent out by EMIS. So we needed to revert those products to locally maintained items just so we could get the dispensing units matched up to allow them to dispense. And the final point I'll make is that some units are just not as practical as you'd like, which is something about like Nutella's clear powder. So the dosing units is grams. That's correct. Its DM&D code would be grams as a dose unit. But from a practical point of view, we would generally use scoops as the unit of measure. So we built it in the system as grams, but we just had to include some additional information for the nurses for administration that just states 1.25 grams equals 1 scoop. But it would be nice to have the option for scoops to be a unit of measure that could be used perhaps. So that's the general configuration parts that we had to focus on. So next I'll move over towards the actual DM&D mapping of the formulae. So I'm going to assume everyone who's listening is going to be familiar with the sort of DM&D 5-box model. So for items to go over the interface, we have to map to an actual DM&D concept. We cannot map to one of the normal Ascribe templates, which you might already be used to using if you already use Ascribe anyway. So some of these templates have already been created. For example, metformin ml tablets is how we would have manually added in metformin in Ascribe previously. And that is also how we would prescribe it in our ePMA system. However, we can't map to that template. It has to be a DM&D concept. And as you might have noticed from my description earlier, our formula doesn't really fall in line with an actual DM&D concept. So we don't correspond to either a VTM or a VMP. We're essentially a VTM plus form. So in the ideal world, we would have designed the interface so that you could build up the product from its constituent points. So yeah, for example, the furosemide that I've got on the screen there, we would have been able to send across the VTM for furosemide, SNOMED CT code for tablets, then it could display as furosemide tablets, colon, followed by the dose sentence. And then for dispensing options, for working out what to supply, the options available could be any VTM plus form combination that was appropriate. That would have been ideal, wasn't how the interface was originally designed. So how we then had to go about it was we had to find what the best match was to a real DM&D concept. So for most items, this is just use the VTM code. So a practical example of this would be on the screen, and this is how we actually did do it. So in our ePMA system, you can see a prescription there on the left-hand side for furosemide tablets, 80 milligrams in the morning. We'll code and map that at the VTM level, so it comes up as furosemide, colon, then you can see the dose sentence, 80 milligrams once a day in the morning. You do see the raw output underneath as well, so we can see the original prescription there as it was in Allscripts for cross-reference if you need the information. And then the dispensing options that display are any of the VTM options where the route is oral. So they don't use the form code for determining what is displayed, it's the route of administration. So for the furosemide, any oral route would be available there for dispensing. And for the majority of items, this works really well, to be honest. Not really had that many problems with it. Occasionally you get a bit of slight confusion, but on the whole, it's a perfectly fine way of doing things. So, 1 second. So that's pretty much straightforward VTM described and covered. I mentioned that some items we do have in the system built as products. So that is where we have combination products or liquids. So for a combination item, the dose units has to be tablets or a similar type of unit. So for example, the Coamilafuse 5/40 milligram tablets, that has to have a dosage unit of number of tablets for EMIS to be able to dispense it. Makes sense to understand why it's like that. Product-based dispensing for those does make sense because it doesn't necessarily make sense just to combine the total mass of the ingredients and refer to that as a dose. And also the ratio of the constituents might not always be the same across every possible strength. So And that's why it's the way it is, and that works fine. Same for comoxiclav, dose units has to be millilitres, and really you wouldn't normally refer to that one as 313 millilitres, milligrams per 5 mils, so it makes sense the way it works. For a straightforward liquid though, where it's only a single component like a furosemide or solution, it will accept either milligrams or millilitres. So you could choose to leave the strength out if you wanted and dose in milligrams, but we include the strength so they've got the option to continue to use millilitres because they're already accustomed to that for either combination products. So both are viable options for us. The big one that really comes up is the special formulations. So items such as modified release or dispersible are where we run into our biggest problem really. So as mentioned, the formulation code isn't really sent over to EMIS and doesn't really come into play. So we had a problem translating a little bit between the dose-based prescribing versus product-based prescribing in the systems. So the way we went about doing this, I'll bring up an example now. We really have two options for a special formulation. We could either use a VTM like we do for all the other products, and that's the example at the top there. But if we do this, you wouldn't be able to see the special formulation was requested, except in the yellow box. And also then all options for that VTM would be available for dispensing. So if you send across metformin, it just displays as metformin and anything could be selected. We felt that was too big a risk that most likely it would end up getting dispensing errors that way around. So the only other option we had was a VMP level prescribing. So we just pick generally the lowest strength VMP that we keep in. So for example, the metformin 500 milligram MR tablets. And while that isn't an exact match, it's a mismatch because we wouldn't include the name in the actual original prescription. It doesn't really matter. We're essentially using it as a tool. So when you send across the VMP for a particular modified release tablet, all the options are available then to select from to make up the dose required. So from that prescription there, I could use 3 500 milligram tablets or 2 750 tablets. No problem at all. It's just an easy way of doing it. So really that's where it's fine. It does occasionally cause a bit of confusion for some people, but we just had to find a pragmatic way of making it work. And it's just about making sure staff are educated on the way it works. And again, if in doubt, check your yellow box. That's the original prescription really.
Max, sorry to interrupt. I know you're full flow there. We've had a question come across, and it's possibly one that I suspect other people will be interested in as well. For the medications that you don't currently pass through the interface, what process do you have in place to manage those?
Yeah, no problem. So the vast majority of our catalogue is coded and goes over the interface. The only places that aren't really are items from our ICU, because they are made up on the ward anyway. So like, quad noradrenaline and things like that, they're all made up on the ward. So they're just supplied to the ward anyway as ward stock items and made up there. So that's not something we've got a particular problem for. If there was I'm trying to think what we don't have on the system really, is anything that's possibly not in ePMA anyway. So we have a number of items that are not live on ePMA, and they're sort of complex infusions like a GCN infusion or fluid prescribing. So they don't go over the interface, but they're also not prescribed on ePMA yet. So we've not had too much of a problem there. But essentially, you just don't need to assign something a supply policy if you don't want, and then nothing will come over. It's then just about educating your staff on if you need to do a supply request for X, then you need to manually go into a scribe and order it. But depending on what it is, it might not be something you'd have requested on a patient basis anyway. It may have been a ward stock item. So there is some items that I can briefly mention later on where we do have to manually put them on, particularly around discharges. And that's just a case about educating the staff about knowing which items don't come over. So you need to make sure they get added on separately. And at the moment, we are having staff just check both systems. So once they've done a supply request, they just quickly look in a scribe, check it's there, and then all good to go. If for any reason it's not there, then refresh it, and if not, manually add it on and let us know, and then we can investigate the problem. But yeah, I'll move on now to the product-based prescribing. So I've covered special formulations, VTM, VMP. I'll just briefly touch on the AMPs. So we do have some branded medication in the system, so we would typically use a branded prescribing for things like a topical cream, which isn't really known to have a generic like E45 cream, or for insulins, just to prevent any accidental switching for biosimilars. These are built completely as branded products in ePMA, so that gives us a one-to-one mapping with the AMP code anyway. The issue that we come across is where we want to have dose-based prescribing for a brand-specific medication. So something like tacrolimus or diltiazem, where we want it to be prescribed by brand name, but we want to retain our ability for dose-based prescribing. That's where we had our problems. Unfortunately, the trick that we had for our special formulations, where we just sent across the VMP code and then allowed people to select any option they wanted, doesn't work for AMPs. If you send across an AMP code, it is locked to that code, so it's restricted down to just that item. It doesn't give you the option to select a different strength if that's not available. So really, we came down to only having a couple of options for this. We either had to, hold on. Yeah, so we couldn't really use the AMP because it didn't give us the flexibility then to dispense a different item. So we could go down one of two ways. We could rebuild our formula so that it was product-based prescribing and build each individual branded product as a separate drug. That's a completely valid way of doing it. We weren't keen on that because we tend to find that if we do any product-based prescribing for things like that, if it was for tacrolimus 5 mg capsules and then the dose was 6 mg, they might not prescribe the other one, or if we needed to provide an alternative because we didn't have that strength in stock, the prescription would need to be changed. It tends to cause us some problems. As well for administration, if nurses see tacrolimus 5 mg capsules and the dose is 10 mg, sometimes they don't read the dose, they just see the product and the strength in the name and they only administer half the dose or more than the dose, depending on what it is. It's just really because they're not accustomed to using that type of prescribing. So we didn't really want to go down that route if we could avoid it. Of course, that gives us a problem because the only other option we had then was to either use VCM or VMP. So we looked at doing the VMP route, and while it does obviously have some problems, as you can see on the one screen, if we built our tacrolimus Adagraph modified release capsules, we can pick a low strength VMP to send over. So it comes across as tacrolimus 500 mics modified release capsules, 5 mg once a day in the evening. You can see the brand that's required in the yellow box, it's just not in this summary line. But for the dispensing purposes, by using the VMP, we at least restrict the options down to only the formulation that we want. So it's only displaying our modified release formulations. It happens to be that this particular product, we only keep the Adagraph in stock anyway, but if the other ones were kept by us, they would have been displayed there for dispensing. So really for these products, we just rely on our dispensary staff being trained and they're aware what brand specific products are. So they just need to make sure for a brand specific product, they check what the brand was in the yellow box before they select it for dispensing. This might not be the way that other places choose to do it. They may choose to rebase it on product-based prescribing, but this is the way we went for. Ultimately, trying to think of an ideal solution for this, I can't really think of one, because if we could send across the brand name or a manufacturer as a third data item so that you could then choose to narrow it down from that. Brand name and things aren't really a D&D concept that you can send over. So really, I suppose it's something we need to have a continue thinking about, because dose-based prescribing for branded medicines isn't really a very well supported area. So this is the best we could come up with for now. So yeah, I'll jump across to some of the outstanding issues that we've got. Sorry if I'm going too quick. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. But if anyone does have any questions, feel free to try and get them in. So some of the outstanding issues we have is we do have approximately 2,500 prescriptions a day being generated in the system. Approximately, I would say about 32 of these new prescription messages fail. So it's about about 98% success rate really. So it is quite good. The problem is that the new prescriptions, only 32 might fail, but then they tend to compound, because once the prescription's failed, if you send a clinical check message for that, then that fails because there's no prescription. If you send across a clinical check or supply requests, they then fail. So one prescription failure leads to multiple errors in the system. But really, we're just sort of working through the errors that we do have, and then trying to break down what the possible reasons are for them. Is it something that we can fix as a trust? Is it a mapping issue on our side? Is it something for EMIS? Is it something for Allscripts? So it's something that we're continually working on to try and improve. One of the other problems we have is that there is no automated D&D updates as far as Allscripts is concerned. So the TRUD releases are sent out monthly. EMIS on their side of things update their DSS catalogue obviously and push out the updates. But if a D&D code was to change for an item, then we wouldn't have that change in Allscripts yet. And because there's no way of having an automated update, that requires on someone being aware of which codes have changed and whether that's applicable to us. We haven't got an ideal solution for that yet. So really we're relying on EMIS to some extent there, so that if an item that's always worked, for example, simvastatin, suddenly starts generating error reports one day after a DSS update, it would highlight that the error code was for a mismatched product ID. We'd go in, review it, notice the D&D needed changing and swap it out. But that's not an ideal solution, so something that we could look at enhancing there. A couple of other outstanding issues. Sometimes we have messages that go over fine, so they display in EMIS with no problems, but then we're just unable to actually dispense them. It generates an error there. Some of these issues were related to salt formulations, and we do actually have a fix in our test system now, which actually fixes a lot of these dispensing issues. So that's in our test at the moment. It does seem to be working, but as always with an update, once you have an update that fixes one thing, it pops up a new unexpected error somewhere. So we're just trying to get rid of all the little bugs first before we can deploy that into the system, and that should hopefully fix a lot of those types of issues. The other big issue we have at the moment is that in using Allscripts, if we send across a discharge prescription using the now and then style forms in the system, which is a form that you can use for things like a reducing dose of prednisolone, initiation of amiodarone or insulins, using that form with the order reconciliation manager in Allscripts, it doesn't produce the appropriate orders. The orders don't really exist, so there's nothing to send over to EMIS. Which is just sort of an unfortunate bug that we sort of found out later on. So at the moment we're just reviewing our next steps forward for that. So at the moment the staff are just aware that if it's a reducing dose of prednisolone or insulin and it's on a TTO, you need to manually supply request those. And then we're going to be reviewing whether we can use a different style of form in the system to produce those orders instead. Lessons learned. Really, some of the key lessons learned for us were not to underestimate the resources required. So we did turn this around in a very short time frame, really. But the data mapping that was required, the configuration, the testing, the UAT, education and training, trying to have some form of interface specialism on the team, working out how you're going to handle the error messages, and just issue investigation. So when something doesn't work as planned and someone messages, digging into the root cause of that to try and work out what happened is quite time consuming, really. So it's not to underestimate those resources. Really, it needs to be managed as a project in itself. It's a big chunk of work. We deployed it obviously in sync with our whole EPR deployment because for us it was a necessity. So we wanted to make sure it was in, but it really needs a lot of attention paid to it. I'd used it as an opportunity as well to do some data cleaning. So we did do some data cleaning in the system as we were going through. But really, if you've got the opportunity, it might be a good chance to rebase on some standards for, like the SNOMED CT definitions for routes of administration and, frequency codes and things where you can, just to get rid of any technical debt that you might have hanging around historically. Process mapping, make sure you test out all scenarios. We obviously did do a lot of process mapping, but then we did come across one issue which caused us all sorts of problems at first. So it was where medication prescribed in an A&E visit, because our A&E visits are a separate visit ID from our inpatient visits. If medication was prescribed in A&E and then the patient was admitted to the trust, the medication would carry over because Allscripts is set up to chart group those items in, but the visit ID is not known to EMIS, so we could never get those messages to come over. Once we realised what the problem was, we developed a workaround for it where we essentially recreate the messages at a later time when a clinical check's done. So we found quite an ingenious solution to that. And that actually came in really useful just because this weekend we actually had our PAS upgrade. So our PAS system was down temporarily. So that meant we had some visit IDs not matching. But once the visit IDs were sort of merged and recreated, that workaround that we had for mismatching visit IDs helped us recover from the PAS downtime actually. And yeah, just make sure we've got more testing and more formal UAT. So we did a lot of internal testing, but we didn't really have as much user testing as we probably would have liked to have had from the actual, dispensary staff. And that was really probably just down to time constraints for getting the system live. Last points then. So just a few things for the future really, which is a bit of a wish list. So automated catalogue updates in line with DM&D. Whether that's having the Allscripts catalogue based on something different like FMD or something like that, FDB, sorry, which is more DM&D aware. We're going to be working on a dashboard for the interface errors to display in pharmacy. So at the moment, the error reports and error handling is quite manual, and the error reports are just dropped into folders where we then sort of manage them, and we require people to check into systems. What we really want to do is have that displayed on a dashboard in pharmacy. Now that our numbers are getting down, where they can just see what the error was, what the drug was, who it was on, and then the dispenser staff can just contact the person and make sure it gets resolved appropriately. Ideally, I'd love to see if the interface was slightly redesigned to allow form code to be used, because that would allow much better sort of mapping based on the concepts that we use our formulary in. Or if we had the ability to map to the Ascribe templates, because that's how Ascribe worked on its own standalone beforehand. So if we could map directly to those templates instead of just the DM&D concepts, that'd be a much easier way around. And then we just intend to fix various outstanding issues that we have, things like a random drug like a Ferinject for some reason just causes an internal application error when you try to supply request it. It's logged with EMIS, I'm sure they're working hard on it, but we have occasional bugs that are just being worked out. And that's it really from me. I'll hand back over now to the rest of the team. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Max. It's Steve McEwen here. I'm the product manager of a hospital pharmacy, and as well as the pharmacy product itself, my responsibility really is to make this all of Max's wish list come true in a way. And so that's what I'm going to try and just take you through a few things here, so you can see. Hopefully you can see my screen. Oh, I've still got yours on. I think Max on there. Bear with me. Is that being shared, guys? I can't see from here. Have you stopped sharing, Max?
I've just stopped sharing mine, see if that helps.
Not sharing yet, Steve.
Is it not sharing? I've got no menu on the screen to share. I can reshare. I think we're okay. Okay, hopefully that's okay. Okay, so clearly Max has taken us through quite a lot of detail there, and some of the lessons learned we've also learned. I just wanted to share some of our thoughts on this, about what we want to do going forward with this. Whilst this interface has been designed primarily with Allscripts, we are going to be using the same interface for other suppliers. We have interest from both Cerner and from InterSystems in a similar way, and it's been written in a way that hopefully we can do this in a generic way to a standard. Now, one of the big things that currently the spec runs to, I think, 82 pages. So all parties really have to understand this intimately, this interface. Us, the customers, the third-party suppliers such as Allscripts or any other vendor really, And Max has pointed out some of the good bits and some of the challenges we've still got to overcome on some of this stuff. But it's obviously a key point that we need to address going forward. And we'll be following things up with Max and his team at a later date on some of this stuff. Max has already touched on this as well in terms of the UAT process, the way the actual wider project goes on, because I think, I'm not sure Max really outlined the fact that you took the ePMA system live at the same time as we did the interface. It's quite a big bang approach, really, in a way. And there were one or two things that caught all of us out a little bit in terms of, I think, we're going into the A&E system, which wasn't really mapped out properly in a process way, which caused the challenge that Max has alluded to at the end with the timings, with the prescription creation, because of the way the episode had been created in the past system. So that was a real good lessons learned. It was in the specification, but I think it's a real life illustration of some of the challenges in practical terms with doing this, that you can write it all down on paper, but actually when it comes to the reality, that there are challenges that come out of this, you have to work as a team to resolve. And I recall vividly a meeting where Max and Chris from the trust came across to the office in Bolton, and we all sat around in the room for a couple of hours trying to work through the process to identify this. And this was very much illustrative of the partnership working to solve a problem, which we want to engender with other projects of this nature. So thorough UAT is key to go through all the scenarios. Max has again alluded to this in his presentation, so that we can try to address this issue in DM&D coding challenges. One of the big things that Max alluded to is some of the challenges we had with things like hydrocortisone salts and cyclazine salts, with two to name. I think we had several attempts at trying to get that resolved for Max and his team. But the good thing is that we have got our in-house data team that provides a fantastic service, does the DM&D mapping, which is a prerequisite to this sort of project, because we're trying to use all of that. And we can fill gaps quite quickly in some of that work and address some of those challenges. We can also, if need be, offer that mapping as a service, because we're not quite sure of the capabilities of all the other suppliers in the market at the moment with this, but we certainly can do all that piece of work, which might help to expedite the projects going forward. Now, all of those above there, just a summary list, and come out to make smoother implementations in the future. There was an awful lot of work went into this from all parties, and I know that certainly from our perspective, it was a quite a labour-intensive process to get to this point. But being first of type, you would sort of expect that, really. We've learned quite a lot of things going forward, so that we're going to make these smoother in the future, hopefully. And that's a summary of those things there. And then just going forward, we've got a few enhancements that have come out of that. Max has touched on a few of those. I and Lauren and several other members of the team were actually on the Interopen event last week. Try to do this in a FHIR specification, because clearly FHIR and the dose syntaxing is the latest and greatest standard coming out of NHS X and NHS Digital, and we're trying to get ahead of the game on that one as well. That we learned some really valuable lessons over those 2 days about some of the challenges to address that, where we're strong, where we need to do some more work on that. We also recognise that there's some additional mapping capability we want to put into the interface to make it easier to map some of the aliases. The interface technically is still in HL7 format. We will be moving to FHIR over time, but if we can do something in the short term to ease the mapping effort on both sides, that's obviously worth doing. Error handling, Max has mentioned a couple of things there with some of the errors. We're going to try and do something on the error handling as well to make it a bit easier to identify what that really means, because often errors are very technical in nature. They're not very descriptive of for the user. So we're going to do some work on that. And we also recognise that there's some challenges around the holding of multiple dosing units and issue units for each product. So there are certain things. I think Max was alluding to the fact that tablets was one of those things that it had to be. But if we're looking at, it could be milligrams, or it could be tablets, it could be puffs, or it could be micrograms for an inhaler. And if we can do more work on that sort of mapping between those different types of issue unit and dosing unit, I think that would make life easier for all sorts of reasons. And the frequency mapping capabilities, that's one of the big challenges that Max called out, and we also found on the Interopen event last week, because there's a big difference between what a prescriber classes as a frequency and what the pharmacy team would actually put on the label in terms of more verbose instructions for the patient. And very specific instructions for certain drugs as well. So all of those things there at the bottom are hopefully going to be enhancements that we can put into this going forward. But it's been a really valuable lesson for us as well, trying to do this for real. So what we've done is aspiration of NHS Digital, and we've converted this into a real world solution for hospitals and other organisations who want to go down this path. Okay, so I think that's my presentation done. I think we'll probably move to questions now. That's been posted in the chat.
Thanks, Steve. So I think we have a question first that hasn't been answered, which is, could you tell us about the trust staff hours or FTEs needed to bring the interface into use? My experience is that time on this type of complex pharmacy project is frequently underestimated. Max, that's probably one for you.
Yeah. To be honest, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many hours it took us. Sort of full-time spending a lot. We spent probably 2 to 3 staff members, spent a couple of months working quite hard on this to get it from the initial kickoff to go live. So it was quite a quick turnaround, but it was a lot of work. I could try and see if we could look back and try and sort of estimate those hours and put those in for the future. But off the top of my head, not positive, but a couple of staff for probably about 3 months.
Thanks, Max. And I think we are going to repeat this session at some other events as well. So it might be worth collating that information for the next round of this. Next question is, how do you prescribe and order and supply non-formulary items?
No problem. So we've got 2 ways that you might be able to prescribe a non-formulary item. So we do have some items that are built into ePMA, which are technically non-formulary, but they're listed in the system just like anything else. And they're there because patients are actually on them. So if it's something that we frequently see patients on, everyone's policy might be different on how you manage non-formulary items. But for us, if we have in the system, it's non-formulary, but the patient's already on it, we might continue the supply that they already had. We wouldn't necessarily change them over. Depends on what the items are. So we've got some items that are in the system, in which case you can just prescribe it, dispense it, supply request it, just like anything else. There was no problems there. If it's something that's just not known to the trust because we've never used it, that would not be an ePMA at all. So in that case, we would we have an item that's just called Drug C Notes, and it's essentially a free text way of prescribing medication in Allscripts. So they could just free text the drug into there, but then that's not something that would be able to go over the interface. So if someone wanted to do a supply request for that, they would have to, 1, manually add it into EMIS to do a supply request, but 2, if it's not in the system, it's probably not in EMIS either. So we'd probably need a non-formulary item request to actually get it added into EMIS in the first place. So depending on the turnaround time that was needed for, we might just then get it built in the system and tell them to re-prescribe it.
Thanks, Max. Next question is, do you have a list of suppliers that you are already capable of interfacing with? I think Steve briefly mentioned it in his presentation, but essentially this is less about the suppliers and more about the message format. So we can interface from an EMIS perspective with any supplier. If that's it currently in HL7, there's some work in terms of mapping that needs to be done that you've heard about, but it's more about the HL7 messaging than the actual supplier. As Steve mentioned, we're currently scoping fire messaging, and we did a proof of concept at a hackathon last week. That will mean that we'll be able to interoperate with other suppliers that have a fire interface. So it's less about the supplier. But James, do you have anything else to add to that from a Allscripts perspective?
Just echoing the same things you've said, I think, Lauren. You know, we too are in the process of assessing fire. We've got clients who use the other brand of pharmacy system out there, and therefore want to use fire, and we see that as advantageous for many reasons as well, though. So yeah, we're engaged in that.
Great, thank you. Next question is probably one for Max. Have you found that patients miss doses more frequently because staff have to undertake workarounds?
No, that's not something we've really come across, because I mean, all they've got to do is click a button to do a supply request. They would have to check the system to make sure it potentially came across, especially if it was something that was timely, like it was a critical medicine. But it's not particularly any slower. From the nurse's perspective, the processes originally stayed exactly the same, so they were writing in a paper diary for non-urgent things, and they would just bleep the pharmacist or ring the pharmacist if it was urgent. We now do actually have an electronic referral in the system, so in Allscripts we are now having a referral to pharmacists. They can do supply requests via a referral, and that was just because they just made the decision that we didn't want to give them complete access to the supply request button in itself, just because pharmacy might get inundated with inappropriate requests then. So they do it as a referral, which we then review and then accept and supply as needed. But no, we've not come across any additional delays, particularly with doses.
Okay, thanks, Max. Next one's probably for you as well. And did the integration cover outpatients?
No, not yet. So we just went live with our inpatient prescribing first, but we're starting to look at the scoping of our outpatient prescribing now, really. So the plan will be that once we do go live with our outpatient prescribing and outpatient prescriptions begin to be written on Allscripts, the hope would be that we would then be able to send those prescriptions via the interface into EMIS, so that we can begin dispensing them while the patient's on their way down. We may choose to continue to print out, for example, a token, which essentially look like the prescription, just for the patient to bring down and have in their hand, and then they could have the prescription exemptions on the back of that. But hopefully the actual message will come over. But that's still in the scope and exercise at the moment. There would be some additional work needed, because at the moment EMIS only receives information from our PAS system for the inpatient visits. It's not actually aware of any of the outpatient visits. So that's a whole extra process we'd have to do to make the PAS interface supply EMIS with all the outpatients as well. Because if there's not a known visit ID, there's nothing for that prescription to sit against. So not yet, but it's on the cards to be doing soon.
Thanks, Max. Next one is, how big a challenge does this interface pose when medicines contracts are changed through CMU? I don't know, Steve, if you want to cover that, and Max maybe follow up.
Yeah, I can. I mean, from our perspective, it's probably not so much of an issue, because all the items in the drug catalogue are coded DMD wise from our perspective. So the master file that feeds the local file within the Bolton drug file is already there. So the DMD code is already present where they are present. So swapping contracts shouldn't really have an issue, other than possibly mismatches that might occur between the prescription. It will very much depend on the detail level of which that code is there. I can't recall, Max, whether you have the contract update interface that takes the CMU file and uploads it directly, but it is just changing suppliers effectively of that item. And that can be all automated. It's already automated in terms of the contract updates. They're post-dated. So it could be feasibly that you could run a report on that to identify any mismatch items. But I don't know if you've actually done it in practice, Max, since you went live with the contract update. I mean, they tend to be what, August and September time, and March to April time, the big ones.
So I don't think, I'm not sure, I'm not normally involved in that side of the scribe, so it's not something that I've had to be dealing with. I don't think it would be a problem though, because most of our mapping is done more at a VTM and VMP level. So individual manufacturers' brands wouldn't be applicable, because essentially it works in a lookup tree. So if you look up a VTM, it'll display all the things below that in the tree. Because we're not mapping at that individual AMP or AMPP level, switching that out shouldn't really be an issue, I wouldn't imagine. If there was a mismatch anyway, and essentially the D&D code just no longer matched, it would just generate an error and not go over the interface. We would then pick that up in our error logs, and people would report to us that I can no longer supply request X, and then it'd just be a case of switching the code out to whatever the code for the new item is in a scribe. So we've not really come across it yet, so we'll wait and see, I suppose.
Thanks both. Next question is, please tell us a little about how the interface has changed prescriber, pharmacy tech or pharmacist workflows. What are users telling you about their experience prescribing meds management and dispensing using the interface? Max, that's probably one for you.
No problem. So from a prescribing point of view, obviously we went live as a big bang with an entire new EPR and electronic prescribing entirely. So big difference there for everyone. But as far as medical and nursing staff are concerned, they're completely unaware of the interface. They don't know whether or not we would need to manually do it. It goes across automatically for them. They're not concerned. The only issue we probably do have is around those products where we do have actual products prescribing. So there's only really, I think, controlled drugs that we built as actual products. So we built those as well as VMPs, not AMPs. So they will come up as morphine sulfate 10 mg modified release capsules. We built them that way so that over the interface we get more of a one-to-one mapping with our controlled drugs. It means that on the discharge prescriptions, the strength and formulation are there, so it already meets those legal requirements. The only thing they need to do is add a quantity, and that's a mandatory field on the form for them. So we built the controlled drugs as products like that, but that does cause prescribers some problems. So I sort of alluded to it vaguely before. When we use any actual sort of product-based prescribing at the trust, because that's not how they're accustomed to working. If they want a dose of morphine sulfate 50 mg, they don't really want to prescribe 30 mg capsules and then 2 10 mg capsules. So they might end up prescribing 30 mg capsules with a dose of 50, which then doesn't make sense. Nurses then, we supply them as ward stock anyway, and would administer it from the controlled drugs cabinet. But at the point that then goes to a discharge, it then causes some problems there occasionally. So occasionally they might need slight changes to the prescription, but on the whole, there's probably a lot less changes needed by them than when they had to know the strength and formulation of everything we kept before, when they had to handwrite it. So it's probably an improvement there in general, but some issues and some risks do get raised by that. As far as the pharmacy side of things, so for pharmacists doing clinical checks and supply requests, and I'll tie the technicians in there as well because they do the supply requesting along with the pharmacist. It has been a big change to workflows. Because it was so new, we did have a lot of issues at first around a lot of messages failing, people not understanding the system properly. It did put an extra task on people. So essentially people had to work in two systems at first. They had to look at the Allscripts ePMA system, and then they had to go and check EMIS to make sure it had gone over and check it was correct. And we're still doing that to some extent, but in some respects, we had a lot of that transcription anyway. So for inpatient prescribing, you had to check a WARDEX and then you had to manually update EMIS as well. So it's similar to that, but it was slower. It had slowed people down at first. As the interface has become more reliable and slicker, I think that has improved. And from the point of TTOs, it probably has got, so inpatient wise is probably similar, but maybe a bit slower at first. Discharges, again, at first a little bit slower, and it probably still is, but that was because we completely did our discharges on a scribe before. So this is now adding in some additional complexity that wasn't there. But yeah, it's been taken reasonably well. We have had it go down once or twice due to some network issues and some other reasons it's had to go down, and people weren't happy when they had to manually do stuff, I can tell you that. So it does appear that even if people do find it inconvenient at times, on the whole it seems to be fairly positive. Yeah.
Thanks, Max. Just for the benefit of maybe some of our EMIS customers on the call, from EMIS we've noticed that the workflow does change for customers or trusts that use our pharmacy system with electronic medicines management. So that's a module that's used to manage ward-based activity and clinically check and order medicines at ward level. So when a trust does then take a third-party prescribing system, some of that workflow naturally shifts to the ePMA system, because you would want your clinical check-in and some of your supply requesting done within the ePMA module. And we've seen that's the shift, so that it's then getting your users at a trust level to do that activity within the ePMA rather than it within EMIS pharmacy.
I think it's fair to say, Lauren, to add to that, we had to make some modifications to our standard EMM process to accommodate that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. Is the interface built on standard HL7 messaging? Probably quite an easy one, but James, do you want to take that one?
The short answer is yes. So obviously the work went into ensuring that all the standard dictionaries aligned in both systems, which Max has described that process. But in theory, yeah, this was something that all parties wanted to be able to lift and shift and use elsewhere. So it was very much underpinned by the standard HL7 terms and dictionaries.
Thanks, James. Next question is it worth considering an automated test to run after a DM&D update to identify failures via a report and then change this to avoid it happening in a live scenario? I suppose that's one for all of us, really. Steve, do you want to pick that up?
It's an interesting idea, I have to say. I mean, we don't currently do that, and it may well be something we can investigate, I think. But I've mentioned, obviously, our DM&D updates are almost automatic anyway. They're on a schedule, so those updates will get applied naturally at the end of each TRUD file coming down from NHS Shared Business Services. I don't think we've got anything in place at the moment to query what might be done on prescriptions from the Allscripts side, but because both the drug files on both sides are dynamic, really, in the way that prescribing is, it might be something it's worth us considering going forward in the generic sense, rather than just linking it directly to a DM&D update, because there will be changes, and the first you'll see, unless you test it fully beforehand, is a mismatch. So it could well be that is the case, and perhaps Max, you can try to identify how many changes there would be on the prescription side of it that might make that worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, from our side of it, obviously, as new items are created or removed or changed, we just base it on whatever the current DM&D was. And before it goes live in the system, we check it against the interface first to make sure it displays as intended. So as we add them, we make sure they're all tested fully. But yeah, as the TRUD releases come down, there would be definitely some sort of automation would be useful, because we did find at one point, I don't know if it's stopped a little bit now, but there was definitely some issues when the TRUD releases came into EMIS. Suddenly items that always used to work stopped working, and I think that was around some accidental changes made to things like the units of measure for like capsules became caps, and there was some of the stuff that we were translating for it got amended, and then it suddenly broke things and then had to be reverted back. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if at EMIS side of things, if you do particularly any testing against how things would work via an interface. I assume those are tested in the standard sense, but with us being the only trust who uses the interface into EMIS, whether it's worth some sort of working together, try and work out how we could do some sort of automated testing for the future, so we check that no future updates or changes on either side break anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think. Sorry, go, James.
So, yeah, just to contribute from our point of view, I mean, I think before we were talking about some of the advantage of being dose-based prescribing, and what that means on the whole is that, you know, the DM&D codes we use are at a higher level, and in which case the necessity to match on a one-to-one basis isn't really there. That said, I think it's really important that we do understand the implications of changes as and when they arrive. But I think the route that we would probably take or want to take is something about looking at the delta between where we are and then as updates come, what does that mean in terms of change? So be able to kind of generate a report based on that. And the question about could we set up an interface to fire all messages through, where we could, I think the overheads around doing and managing that, even if it's automated, would still be fairly considerable. And I think it's one of these that it needs to be targeted. I think we're not going to be massively impacted from a prescribing point of view when these changes come around, but we're happy to join in the conversation and see what solution works best for everybody.
Yeah, I think it might be worth us trying to size that as a team afterwards and just see, you know, whether that's worth doing. But as Max has already alluded to, you know, if it's being tested first, I mean, we have test harnesses for both sides, so you can always run it through in a dummy sense before you do it, because you're making an active conscious decision to change something, and that's as good a point as any to test it.
Thanks, Steve. Next question is about fire. I think we've answered that one. And probably the question around how large was your project team. The only additional, I suppose, input that we've got to that is as well as the deployment team from Bolton, there was obviously an implementation team at Allscripts and at EMIS to support, and then wider business support as well with the data mapping and developments that we undertook as part of the implementation. So I think it's fair to say that it was quite a significant task. It's quite a significant amount of implementation effort, but actually that meant that it was able to be big bang, full trust straight away, and it's contributed to the success that you've heard about. Next question, James, one for you. How is Allscripts Sunrise using the interface pharmacy data in other modules of its functionality?
That's a good question. At this moment in time and at Bolton, we're not currently using that data anywhere else. One of the things that we definitely want to explore is getting information back in from EMIS about items that are dispensed. Now that's something that we've spoken about. I think if we're going to do that, we may as well round that up into the FHIR interface and into new capabilities. But I see quite a lot of potential there for overlap. So we've spoken already about DM&D, and if there was a potential there to utilise some of that valuable drug data that EMIS has, we'd definitely be open to discussions around that. And I think as well, you know, we've talked about ward stock supply and the potential for supporting that within Sunrise, making it easily accessible for nursing staff or other EPR users, as well as functions like prescription tracker, which I know EMIS have. I think there's lots of potential there, and as we move forward, I'm sure we'll explore more of those in more detail. And again, you know, happy to hear suggestions from the audience around where they think that we should target our focus on that.
Yeah, just say from a trust side as well, it would be great for, because at the moment the interface is unidirectional, it's not bidirectional, but if in the future having that information in the system for use would be really useful. So yeah, like you say, the pod information, all sorts of things we could do, especially as you move towards potentially more closed loop around like barcode scanning, things like that, actually getting a more accurate view of the quantity of medicines that have been used across wards and areas. It'd be nice to see that, because actually you get that kind of information from EMIS normally, from what you've dispensed and what you've ward stocked to areas, but you can't then tally that against what's actually been administered. So you've always got that knowledge gap, which is the kind of thing that you sometimes have to do investigations around, where there's unusually high requests for certain items. In the future, potentially you could tally the two together to see actually administered versus supplied to the ward. So.
Absolutely, and I suppose in any ePMA implementation, you implement and you get over the first hurdles and the first change management challenges, and then you start to look at what improvements can be made, what improvements to the products can be made, and obviously workflow and processes. So it feels like we're probably at that stage now, and collating the lessons learned from this and some of the enhancements that we gathered over the past few months. We already discussed having some sessions on how we can further develop the interface or both of our products to better support. Okay, next question. What version of Sunrise are you running?
17.3. Sorry, Max, I don't know if you're on mute or not there. Just to call out as well the fact that there's no dependencies on version for this from a Sunrise point of view, so we can generate the outbound HL7. So for any Sunrise clients that are listening.
Thank you. Next two questions are around closed loop scanning. So do you use any closed loop scanning or intelligent storage, and how are these medicines supplied? Are they dispensed? So Max, do you want to answer that?
So we don't have any closed loop barcode scanning at the patient level yet, but something around that sort of scan for safety is something that I'd like to have on the radar in the future. I know Salford Royal were working quite hard on that recently. I talked to them about a month ago and they were making some good progress, but I'm not quite sure where they are at the moment. So to be fair, we'll probably see how they get on with it, and then we'll do a bit of quid pro quo. They can have a look at our interface, we can have a look at their barcode scanning, and maybe do a bit of exchanging of information there. So not yet, but it's something we're really interested in doing. And as far as intelligent storage goes, we don't currently have any like Omnicells or those types of dispensing cabinets available at the moment, but we are currently looking at business cases for getting those into A&E and a couple of particular areas. So we don't have any yet, but it's something we are looking at.
Great, thank you. James, do you have anything to add on that?
No, just to say that Salford we're in the process of implementing our KBMA solution. So that is the closed loop module for medicine management. Unfortunately, COVID hit and derailed everything, as I'm sure it has for most people, sort of changed the plans for this year. But we're still actively engaged there, and hopefully we'll be picking that project up again in the not too distant future.
Thank you. Next one is similar but different. So do you have any FMD workflow integrated? So Steve, do you want to pick that up from an EMIS perspective, and probably Max as well?
The FMD one. At the moment, we've got FMD as a separate application at the moment. We're looking at whether or not to integrate that fully with the stores module at the moment, because but I think the whole Brexit debate is could throw that one into disarray. We don't quite know what that's going to mean, because it's a European initiative, of course. So the answer is we haven't currently, from our perspective. Max wants to add anything into that.
Yeah, so I mean, we were getting ready to deploy an FMD solution at the trust towards sort of the beginning of the year, but then obviously COVID hit and it's been put on, hold for now. So I know it's something that is being picked back up. It's not myself who's involved. It's the IT systems manager Louise, but it's something we are trying to get up and running. But it's a third-party version that we're using and provided by another NHS trust.
Thank you. What clinical decision support did you use to manage allergies, and was that from EMIS or Bolton?
Yeah, no problem. So as far as clinical decision support goes in, we've set it quite low, but possibly more than some places. So we do have clinical decision support turned on for allergies. So virtually every drug in the catalogue is mapped to Bolton in Allscripts. So that's what provides our allergy alerting in the system. So if you try to prescribe anything that's in the allergy class, it will alert. We do also have duplicate checking turned on. So if there's more than 2 items of the same therapeutic class prescribed, it will alert in Allscripts for those as well. At the moment, that's probably more sensitive than we would like it to be. So we are trying to look and try and get that turned down a little bit because it does tend to over alert and cause a bit of alert fatigue for people. So yeah, all our clinical support currently is from Bolton in Allscripts. We would like to go further with clinical support in the future to actually have much more intelligent support. But I think we were querying whether we hold off until the first data bank stuff is available in Allscripts, and maybe there might be different options available for us there with varying levels of alerting available. So we've got some, but not all.
Thanks, Max. Next question, does maintaining the interface require ongoing resource, or is it just about the same time it takes to build drugs on both systems?
So maintaining it definitely is taking a lot of time and effort. Whether that's because we're still getting over this early adopter tax really that we have as being the first of type. So we're still trying to manage sort of the errors that come across and any unusual things that are still happening, occasional mismatches in D&D codes. So we've got a lot of work on, but a lot of it is really investigatory work, trying to work out why that happened. Because if something's failed, we can't really just say, oh, this didn't work. We need to say it didn't work. It matches the EMIS specification. Everything is correct. Why did it not work? Or it might be the fact that it's not worked because something's not supported on the Allscripts side. Or it might be simply that we need to make a small change on our side and it's something that we can do in-house. So it's really the investigatory work trying to get to the bottom of things first that takes the time. So at the moment, yeah, it does take a lot of man hours. Every day there's something to do on it. That's just sort of maintenance work.
Okay, thank you. We're nearly up for time, so I think we can probably cover the next few questions off in one go. So are you using the interface for discharges, and how does the interface work for controlled drugs?
Yeah, no problem. So yes, we do use it for discharges. They're done in a slightly unique way. So that's done via an MLM at the point of document close for the discharge letter. And that looks at any of the medication prescribed in our discharge ORM session that have got a text box that has been set to supply from pharmacy. Any of those items will then generate the HL74 and send them over as a batch to EMIS. So they'll appear in EMIS as a completely new prescription. So you'll have inpatient medicines and then you'll have a new prescription for the discharge. And we do the CDs of the interface. So I think I alluded to it before, we built them as individual products. So we built them as VMPs in the system for CDs, just so we had that sort of more one-to-one matching. But like I said, that it does cause issues from a practical perspective on the ward. So we are bringing that up for review at our medicine safety group, just to try and see where the benefit and risk lies on the best way to manage CDs. The other side would be if we didn't have those products in the system, then it would be much more difficult to manage them over the interface into EMIS. So, yeah.
A similar question on surrounding discharge, actually, but do you have anything in place for updating a discharge summary with the stock amount supplied against the TTO? This is often important information that's overlooked or information which cannot be supplied automatically.
So no, we don't have any information about the quantity supplied on the discharge for the GP. Much as we have on there is whether it's pharmacy supply, stock on the ward, whether the patient's got the drugs at home. There's some information there, but we don't put the actual quantity in. Interesting enough, when we've discussed our discharge summaries with GPs, so occasionally get brought up at the CCG, they just seem to be constantly wanting less information, and they just seem to just not want to care whether or not we supplied any. I disagree with that because I think it's quite important that they know at least that we did supply them with, Zomorph when they went home, so that they know if they come knocking on the door the next day that they have had a supply. But we don't get the quantity; they just get whether or not some was issued or not. But yeah, depending on your CCG, whether they do or actually don't want it might be different.
Okay, thanks, Max. So actually, we're up for time. This has been a really useful and valuable session for us at EMIS, and a big thank you to Max for pulling together the content and for taking everybody through a really comprehensive overview of your findings and learnings. And James, thank you very much for contributing from an Allscripts perspective. We'll absolutely continue to work collaboratively together. And for everybody that's listening, we will be sending out a recording of the session in case anybody had any technical difficulties. That will come out, I think it's going to be published on YouTube and will be sent via email. So thanks everybody for joining, and see you soon.